I spent the last 5 years teaching high school at Miami, and I spent the last 3 of those years as the head girls soccer coach. And while I was there, I guess it quickly became one of my trademarks, was the way I dressed on the sideline. Soccer coaches are different than football or basketball. There's really not a dress code. You go to a high school soccer game and you're probably going to see a soccer coach in a t-shirt and shorts. They actually look like they could run out and play some of the times. But I actually wore usually khaki or gray pants and a sweater vest, and that kind of became my trademark. So my brother had this made for me last year. Some people have kind of been trying to figure out what it is, what it says. And I kind of felt bad because when he gave it to me, I had already decided I was resigning at the end of the year. But my former soccer team officially qualified for the playoffs last night, so I'm wearing this sweater to kind of in their honor because they made the playoffs. But along those same lines, while I was there, kind of like you guys, I decided to respond to God's call, and that led me here. And so I've taken a different path, 5 years of college, a couple of years of this kind of caught up in the air, then 5 years of teaching, and here I am. And I came to Ozark, like most of you guys, to learn how to be a minister, learn how to be a pastor, learn how to preach. I wanted to learn what I needed to get better at. And if there's one thing that Ozark has taught me, what I've learned through listening to people in chapel, listening to the preaching teaching convention, it's that when you are assigned a topic in a sermon series, you're supposed to complain about it. And so here we go. David. I read this, in the paper that Damien gave us, who our topic was, and I asked him, I said, so what about David? And he goes, well, anything. He's like, 1st, 2nd Samuel, the Psalms, take your pick. I'm just like, thanks for whittling that down for me. That's awesome. Because, we look at David, and there's just so much about David. You could just pick up the Bible and start reading in 1 Samuel. You get about halfway through, and you're reading about this character named David, and he quickly becomes one of the heroes of the Old Testament. And we've heard about some of the others these last few days. We heard about Abraham, heard about Joseph, heard about Moses. David is not the first king of Israel, but he's perhaps the greatest. And all the kings that follow, if you read through 1st and 2nd Kings, they're all compared to David. They're held up in his shadow. As you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel, though, you read basically the biography of David. And you read the different parts of his life, how he's chosen by Saul. You read about how he served in Saul's courts. You read about the story of David and Goliath, the story that's so great it transcends the Bible almost, because people who don't even know the Bible know the story of David and Goliath. We read about David and his friendship with Jonathan, David and Bathsheba, the great fall that David has. We read about these different military and political alliances David forms. We read about David's family that gets established in 2 Samuel. And as I read through these, this is like a biography. It plays out in my mind like a movie. And I picture all these different scenes playing out on this canvas. And as we read through the story of David, there's a shift that takes place. And it happens in 2 Samuel 13. We read about 3 of his children. And all they're identified as is a son of David. Amnon, the son of David. Tamar, the sister of Absalom, the son of David. And in this story, Amnon becomes so obsessed with Tamar that he rapes her. And Absalom lashes out and winds up killing Amnon in revenge. And then the story progresses on. Absalom flees. He's eventually welcomed back. He eventually gains the favor of the people to the point where he becomes a threat to David's throne. And in chapter 15, David flees, goes on the run. Absalom pursues him. And eventually in chapter 18, there's a great battle, and Absalom is killed. And of all the stories of David, this one sticks in my mind maybe a little bit more because we see David differently than any other spot. We see a different side of David. We're used to seeing David, the hero, David, the mighty warrior. In 2 Samuel 18, chapter 33, he's informed of the death of his son. by his commander Joab, his military commander who had been there when Absalom was killed. And I love the way this verse reads. It says, he was informed of the death of Absalom. And verse 33 says, the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and he wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son." This is a moment that you would expect David to be celebrating just a little bit. He's defeated not only a political rival, but a very legitimate threat to his throne. And this is a moment that David has experienced time and time again. I mean, after all, he's a man who had so much blood on his hands, God wouldn't let him build a temple. He's defeated these military adversaries his whole life. But the ESV uses these words. It says he was deeply moved over the death of Absalom. New Living says he was overcome with emotion. The Hebrew word that's used here implies trembling or shaking that usually is a result of the wrath of God. So David wasn't just weeping. David was in great agony. He was mourning the death of Absalom. You see, this wasn't just a political adversary. This was his son. And his son was dead. We see here a very dark, a very deep and painful emotion from David that we've never seen before. I don't know how many of you in here, I know a couple of you have children. I'm not an overly emotional guy. I don't get very emotional very often. It's not a sense of, well, I'm a guy, I can't cry. I just don't. You know, and it kind of goes both ways. I don't really have super high highs or super low lows. I stay pretty even keel through most things. My daughter was born almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years ago this July. And on the day she was born, if you guys haven't experienced this yet, when you do, the feeling was of her birth, it happened so fast that I don't even really remember it. I mean, it was a lot faster than normal. And once she's born, they take her and they kind of let you see the baby, and then they take the baby over and they put her on this table that has a scale on it so they can weigh her, they can measure her, they kind of clean her off, they put her under a heat lamp. And they leave her there for a few minutes they left her there until my wife was able to take her back. And they invited me over, so I'm over there with her, and they kind of finished and they said, well, you know, here's your daughter. And I remember she wasn't tiny, but she wasn't very big. You can probably figure that out by looking at me. And I stuck my hand down on her. And my hand pretty much covered her entire chest. And I stuck my hand there and I felt her heartbeat. And I don't really understand the physiology of a newborn's body, but they say babies can't really see very well. They can't see very far. But she looked right at me, and then she grabbed my little pinky. And after she grabbed my pinky, I noticed tears hitting my hand. I didn't even realize it, but I was weeping. And looking back on it, why I was crying about that, what made me sad, I wasn't sad, but what made me overcome with emotion there was this feeling of love that I didn't think I had in me. I mean, I love my wife. You heard Woody yesterday in chapel talk about his love for his wife, and I have that. I love my wife dearly and would do anything for my wife. And I love my family dearly, and I would do anything for them, but this was different. This was a different kind of love because this was a person who just 5 minutes ago hadn't taken a breath yet. And I already had a love for her that said I would do anything for her. There was nothing that would keep me from making sure that she finds God. And I remember thinking this love was so great that I understood what Paul meant in Romans 9 when he tells the Roman church that he would sacrifice his own salvation that they could find theirs. And I understood that. And I think that's what David's weeping about here. David's not simply weeping because his son is dead. This will sound bad, but people bury their children every day. It's a harsh reality. It's a cruel reality, but it happens. David's not simply weeping because his son is dead. He's weeping because his son is cut off from God. His son's living outside of God's plan, outside of God's will, and his son is cut off from that now forever. Absalom had rejected David, but he was still David's son, and David wept over him. And it makes me wonder, makes me ask the question, who should we weep for? And who do we weep for? The Bible tells a similar story to this. It takes place about 1,000 years later, or about 810 pages later, depending which Bible you have. We just talked about this last week, an event that is an incredible event. We had Easter last week, the Passion Week, the triumphal entry, one of the great moments to me in the Bible. And there's 7 steps to the triumphal entry if you read Mark Moore's book. And I don't really have the time to get into the depth of them today. But there's one part of it that we probably overlook a lot. And it jumps out to me when I read it because it doesn't seem like it fits in the flow of the story. But you know the story, the triumphal entry. Jesus mounts the donkey and he rides down the Mount of Olives and he rides into the adoration of all these people. And he confronts the Pharisees. And in Luke 19, verse 41, it says, "As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it." I taught Sunday school a couple weeks ago, and I asked the question, so why does Jesus weep over Jerusalem? And we got a lot of good answers. You know, and I don't. He explains. He makes a statement after this. But I said, why does he weep over Jerusalem? I don't think it's simply because he knows what's about to happen, because he does know. He's been preparing for this moment his entire earthly life. And as we're going to see later in the Gospels, he weeps over that and stresses and distresses over that the night before it happens anyway. But he rides in. This is a very significant moment, this triumphal entry. Think about what Jesus has done up to this point. He's healed people. He's done miracles. And if they declare him the Messiah, what's he always tell them? Don't tell anybody. Shh, keep it a secret. And here he is on the triumphal entry making his first just massively public announcement. I'm the Messiah. Here I am. Everything that he did coming down the Mount of Olives on the donkey was very intentional, very purposeful, very symbolic. The Jews would have understood what it was he was doing. This is a moment he should be celebrating. Here it is. He's the Messiah. Worship him, embrace him. And he weeps. Luke uses the word kleao. Word means that he wept bitterly. In fact, this is the same word that the Gospels use to describe when a parent wails over the death of a child. This wasn't a simple weeping. This wasn't tears hitting his hand and he not realizing he was crying. This was, I think, a very public display of emotion. Jesus is wailing over the people of Jerusalem. And he weeps over them because he knows they're lost. If you read his statements, he's basically saying, you guys don't have a clue what's about to happen to you, but if you just follow me, you'll be all right. You see, the people of Jerusalem, the Jewish people, Jesus is the Messiah they had been expecting for centuries. But as he comes down the Mount of Olives, he's not the Messiah they're wanting. They're wanting the man to come in on the white horse to rescue them from oppression. He's offering them salvation. Not physical salvation, spiritual salvation. And here they are, they're welcoming him, they're waving palm branches and they're shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And 5 days later, they're going to nail him to a tree. They're going to reject him. Much like Absalom rejected David. They're going to reject him, but Jesus weeps over them because these are the children of God. These are the very people He's here to save, and they don't realize it. It makes me wonder, and it makes me ask the question, who should we weep for? I don't know about you. I catch myself a lot of times being a person that I'm not very proud of. I'm a very cynical person. I catch myself seeing people who the world might call fake Christians. You guys might be there. You guys might have done this. And I catch myself pointing that same finger saying, oh, he's just fake. And I wrestle with that. I wrestle between my mind and my heart of knowing what this person is doing, maybe not understanding what this person is going through. And in doing that, it makes me want to side a little bit more with maybe somebody who would lash out if somebody rejects me, as opposed to embracing that person and weeping over them. See, Paul writes Paul claims in Acts 13, that David served the purposes of God in his generation. But yet as we read through that story of Absalom, David is rejected. John tells us that Jesus came to these people, came to his very own, yet they didn't know who he was, and they rejected him. We are going to be rejected as ministers, as pastors, preachers, whatever term you want to use. We're going to be rejected, maybe by friends, maybe by family. Maybe some of us have already been rejected. I'm very fortunate that my family's been very supportive. Even if they haven't completely understood why I gave up a career to come here, they've been very supportive. But there will be times when we will get rejected in life. We'll be opposed in our ministries. People will take our very words and distort them and spit them back out into a way that's tough for us to defend. How will we respond to that? Will we respond with anger? Will we seek revenge? Will we call down the wrath of God on that person? I've heard preachers do that. Strike them down like Ananias and Sapphira. How will we respond? Most of you know the story of Fred Phelps. Fred Phelps was the pastor of Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, the church that protests all the funerals, the church with the cleverly named website GodHatesFags.com. He passed away a little over a month ago. Again, most of you probably know this story, but when he died, there were a lot of jokes made, a lot of one-liners. Jokes like, well, I wonder who will protest his funeral. And I so wanted to make some jokes about that. I mean, after all, this was a man who preached hatred. I don't know his heart. I don't know how he actually stood with God. I can't possibly know that. I know what the external evidence shows. And the external evidence shows that this was a man who wasn't right with God, that this man believed, preached, and spoke heresy. And so I so wanted to make some comments about this, so wanted to try and be funny. And I almost did, more than once. And my heart kept telling me, no, this isn't a cause for celebration. Some people are going to celebrate this man's death, but I shouldn't be one of them. And I actually got on Facebook later and made a post about this, how this isn't a cause for celebration, but this is a cause for mourning. Because if indeed this man did die away from Christ, if indeed the external evidence was true and he did not have God in his heart, then there's no reason to celebrate his death. Only cause for mourning. This is the kind of person we should weep over. See, David's own son rejected him, but he wept over him. The people of God rejected Jesus, and he wept over them. It makes me wonder, and it makes me ask the question, who should we weep for? Let's pray. Father, I ask that you just put in our hearts those who reject us, Lord, that we would weep for them. And that they would be somebody that we would strive to bring to salvation at all costs. And God, that we wouldn't get angry, we wouldn't get upset, but God, we would feel the compassion that you feel them as your children. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.